Welcome everybody here and people who are listening to the live stream on this second roundtable or panel on the war in Ukraine. We have had a first event about 2 weeks ago or so, where we discussed the general situation around the war, and particularly or specifically two items that were related to that, and that was what is the meaning for democracy, but also the implications for the energy transformation of the global system. Today, we want to focus on two items that are coming more to the forefront. And one of them is the refugee crisis that is becoming more visible, also more multifaceted, because not just people who are displaced within the Ukraine, people who are leaving the Ukraine, but there are also some people returning to parts of the Ukraine that, at least for the moment, get a little bit of a reprieve of the military action. And we have a great panel here that I will introduce in a moment, but I have been told that before that, I have to remind everybody who doesn't know yet about all the great events that we will have next week during Earth Week. And so we have programming during 5 days, April 18 to 22, and April 22, the Friday, is actually Earth Day. Among them, on April 19, we have the naming event for ISTP-7. So it will have a real name, and I think we can tell a little bit of the name. We cannot give you the full one. It will be Donor Center for Planetary Health. It will actually become a meaning. And the donor part you will get on Tuesday. We also have, as part of the Tuesday event in the afternoon, starting I think at 1:30 or 2 o'clock, a panel around the future of conservation that will be anchored by a keynote by Peter Seligman, who was the founder of Conservation International. He's now the CEO of Neotero. And we have photographer, filmmaker Keith Lachinsky, and a panel moderated by Susan Goldberg, who is now at ASU, who formerly was the editor-in-chief of National Geographic. After that, there is an open event in the evening that is part of a related but different event, which is Democracy and Climate. And former Vice President Al Gore will be featured via video. After that, I think there is some gathering in the atrium. So with that out of the way, we can actually get to our today's discussion. And it is a great pleasure for me to have with us Pam Delaci to the right. She's professor of practice at the School of Politics and Global Studies and former head of UNFPA, which, to the best of my knowledge, is the United Nations Population Fund. And within that, the humanitarian program. Going just from right to left, we have Fahim Hussain, who is a clinical professor, clinical associate professor at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society, and an affiliated faculty at the Lincoln Center of Applied Ethics. To my left was, I mean, you all probably know all of them, but Kathleen Merrigan, who is the director of the Sweetie Center for Sustainable Food Systems, and the Kelly and Brian Sweetie Professor of Practice in Sustainable Food Systems in the School of Sustainability.
Helpful.
Yeah, it's you are an important person here. So, as I said, to just set the context a little bit, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia started on February 24th. And over a short period of time, we saw quite a bit of effects that we had not imagined to see after World War II. Or it is actually on the scale of what we have seen during World War II, or also in terms of the method of warfare that we are seeing there. We talked a bit about what does that really mean for democracy. A lot of consequences showed up more or less immediately in terms of what can be done about it, because on the one side, we are watching this horrific scenery, almost like on reality TV. We are people killed, casualties. We are seeing cities leveled. Mariupol, it's actually really hard to look at these pictures and imagining that there are still, to the best of my knowledge, roughly 100,000 people living in that city, because the escape routes are in essence not working, and several attempts have been made, but not yet succeeded. By now, we know that this is not just Mariupol, but there are other cities that are under constant shelling and are starting to deteriorate. There is another offensive being put together by the Russians. A convoy is underway towards the eastern part, moving away from Kiev, where there was an effort at the beginning, but now these forces are starting to set themselves up for a major, offensive in the Donbas region. So while this is happening and does not forebode any kind of short-term solution, rather than a deepening of what we have seen so far, we are also seeing some of the effects of this war in the areas where Russia has retreated, in terms of what really appears from everything you can see as war crimes on a large scale. We see more of the casualties. We have information hard to estimate, but Pam will talk to that. What you can see is tens of thousands of casualties at that point, probably underestimated. So we are going into an extended period of warfare that will, to the best of our ability to read the landscape, will intensify before it's over. And so in that context, then, looking at destruction, looking at people who have fled, people who have been relocated, is there actually any time frames we can envision over which this will play out, and after which there will be enough retreat of the line of the actual warfare that people could move back into their home country? And would they actually want to go back, given the situation that we have there? So, and what is your take on this situation where the humanitarian conditions are deteriorating to unimaginable levels? And what would that mean for movement of people in and out of Ukraine?
I'm certainly no expert on what may happen next in this conflict, but I think if we want to look at the humanitarian implications of the conflict, we have to look inside Ukraine, in the region, and then globally as well. It's pretty clear from what we all see on the news every night what is happening inside Ukraine. Whole cities, whole villages completely decimated. A health system almost destroyed in parts of the country. Education systems collapsing. No agriculture right now in what is one of the most important countries in the world for agricultural production. No fuel, food shortages, people moving out back and forth on trains, whatever trains there are to get out. And I think, we won't go into a lot of the atrocities here today, but it's becoming readily apparent that sexual violence is a very important aspect and strategy in this war that has tremendous long-term implications for women and their families and the whole community and the country. Rebuilding will be a tremendous effort, just reconstruction of infrastructure in urban areas, not to mention the psychological or emotional issues that are involved with displacement, family separation. Now it's one slightly peculiar aspect of the situation is this kind of separation of families because there is conscription of men in Ukraine. So a large proportion of people who are fleeing, crossing the border into Poland and other countries are women and children. That in itself has implications as well. We have over 4.5 million people outside Ukraine, 2.5 million in Poland alone. We have about 12 million people inside Ukraine displaced and in urgent need of food, shelter, clothing, safety, etc. And it's a humanitarian crisis, the likes of which the world has not seen in a very, very long time. But I think also if we look a little bit bigger, make the circle bigger and look at the region, just the refugee movement into Europe, which is very interesting politically in terms of European Union refugee policies, asylum policies, and temporary protection directives. 2.5 million Ukrainians in Poland right now. Can you remember in 2015, during the so-called refugee crisis in Europe that year, Germany took in 1 million people. And it was very difficult and very brave and really tough thing to do. That was 1/80th of the German population. 2.5 million people in Poland is 1/15 of the Polish population. They will need 500,000 apartments alone just to house people, or even a short period of time, much less if people decide to stay. But it's actually even more of an implication for a small country like Moldova, who the concentration is even greater. If we take the circle even bigger, by terrible, terrible perfect storm of humanitarian disaster, Russia and the Ukraine are by far the most important producers of wheat, of maize, of fertilizers, traded in the world markets for many, many countries in the world. I have a little chart here that shows that if you all want to hand it around. For instance, the country of Eritrea, 100% of imported wheat is from those two countries. For Egypt, 70% of imported wheat, which is billions of dollars a year, is from only Ukraine and from Russia. Just think for a second the implications of this drop in the sea here. Egypt hasn't had an increase in the price of bread for many, many years. An increase in the price of bread will be very serious. That's exactly what started the Arab Spring in Tunisia before. If we look in other places that are having serious problems right now, Lebanon has a collapsed economy, 2/3 of people below the poverty line. Almost all of their wheat is coming in and their fertilizer coming in from Ukraine and Russia. So what does this mean? This is not going to get there this year. Somalia, Yemen, if we look at the war in Yemen, 2/3 of the population already in food deficits, and gosh, over half of the imported wheat is coming. 40% of the food that runs through the World Food Program is coming from Russia and the Ukraine. So just think about what is happening here. We have Ukraine, a fairly wealthy country, and a country that fed itself, where Ukrainians now need food assistance. And Ukraine, the breadbasket of a large part of the world, is not producing and exporting food. So I think that will just give a sense of what this humanitarian situation is going to be and the waves that will go all across the world from it.
Yeah, great, thanks for this context. On the food system, Kathleen, so Ukraine accounted for about a quarter of the grain export, I think, worldwide, to the extent that I understand it. What, if we will miss one harvest, just to take that as a start, what will that mean? How can we actually make up for that? What's your take on the impact?
Well, of course, there's winter wheat that people plant. So they plant it in the latter part of the year, and you would be harvesting it in the spring. And as I understand it, I mean, my area is really American agriculture. But as I understand it, they're actually, the Russians have been putting mines in Ukrainian fields. So they don't want to harvest that. It's not possible to plant right now, and you can't get your seeds, you can't get your fruit. I mean, the whole thing's a mess. 30%, I think, is the number of the amount of the world that, you know, amount of the wheat that's going out of the country. So I work on US agriculture. And I would say that when I was Deputy Secretary of Agriculture, you would do these very regular meetings with the World Outlook Board. And they would say, what are the projections of what's going on in this country or that country? Because we're a global food system. It's all interconnected. And if you said to me, Ukraine, I'd say wheat. If you said to me, Brazil, I'd say soybeans. If you said Argentina, I'd say beef. I mean, I don't want to play that game here, but you know, it was just so clear to me when we were looking at what influences farmers' decisions to plant certain things across the globe, how prices are rising or falling, really has to do with these big dynamics. So if the Ukraine was having a big year in wheat, well, that would have some impact on American farmers, for example. So it's horrific what we're seeing. I don't know how Ukrainians feed themselves. I also know that the sanctions that we have put in place that I'm very supportive of also has dire impact on people in Russia and Belarus. And there's hunger there, and there's a lot of misinformation and confusion. And I know there are a lot of Russian people who, if they got the full extent of what's going on, would be incredibly upset and beyond the kind of protests we've seen in the streets. So not something that we can easily make up. Right now, US farmers are projected to only produce about 1% more of wheat in this planting season. That could change, it's just a projection. Why wouldn't they be planting it fence row to fence row? Well, there are a lot of reasons. And one has to do with, and Pamela already noted this, is the issue around fertilizer costs. Now, fertilizer costs were already going way up before anything happened in Ukraine. Yeah. Food inflation prices were already going way up before anything happened in the Ukraine. And sometimes I think that I watch those Sunday morning talking head shows because I'm a politico nut, right? And I see these people putting, who I listen to all the time, but they're describing all of these woes in the food situation in the US and globally immediately, like February 24th it started, you know, by February 28th, the world food prices are going way up because of what's going on in the Ukraine. I'm like, well, it's COVID, it's supply chain, it's conflict, it's a lot of things that have come together. And so to use your analogy, the perfect storm, right? So it didn't start here in terms of the stress we're feeling in food systems. It's not going to end here, but I don't think we easily make up what Russia and the Ukraine put out in terms of food. That it's grains, it's wheat, it's corn. Half of the world's supply of sunflowers and sunflower oil comes from that part of the world, which is really important for cooking and very significant. Fertilizers, I've mentioned, that's going to be really huge. And then on top of it, in food systems, I'm not the energy girl. You don't want to talk to me about energy in any depth, but we all know that crude oil prices are going up because of what's going on. And we transport food, whether it's by train, plane, automobile, right? Those prices are going up, and that's going to also have an inflationary impact on food. So in our Masters of Science program in Sustainable Food Systems, we have a course called the American Agriculture in the Global Context, because we're in a global world and you can't sort of look at this country or that country. What's going on now in Ukraine has serious implications for the world. And I was going to say, Pamela said this, I want to underscore it, that 40% of the World Food Program donations go to come from Ukraine in terms of the wheat, and I don't know what we're going to do. And you hear the head of the World Food Program saying, not only is there this missing amount of food that's coming forth that go to very impoverished countries, conflict zones where people are really desperate, but they're also facing things like really increased transportation costs because of insurance, war risk insurance premiums. I was like, what? That on top of everything else. So it's just a mess. How's that? It's a mess.
It's a mess. And to your point of inflation, and when it started, yeah, it started before, but it has accelerated. And if I remember the number correctly, this morning I read that we have an inflation rate that we haven't seen in 60 years or so. So it is actually fairly dramatic, and it's a little bit hard to project where this will go. To the point.
Let me just give you some stats there. So before the war, last year, the corn price rose 57%, live cattle price rose 19%, wheat rose 27%, and sunflower oil tripled in price since 2020. So again, that's the scene setting before the war.
Yeah. And now we have that acceleration. In the view of what is happening and how do we experience that, I don't think we have ever seen a war that blows up as this one. We have reporters on the scene. Quite a few of them lost their life by reporting from Ukraine. We see cities being leveled almost real time. What does it take for the world to react? I mean, of course, there are sanctions, but there are also limits to the sanctions when it comes to the interests of countries, including, for example, Germany, in terms of not cutting the import of gas and oil because they made themselves so dependent. More than 50% of the gas is coming from Russia. More than a third of the oil is coming from Russia. I think they cut the coal import, but that was easy to balance in the world market. So we are seeing that. We put sanctions up there, but we all knew from the beginning, and everybody knew that they will take time, more time than people in Ukraine have to get through that crisis. So what do you think we have available in principle to influence the outcome of that, or the next steps in that war to get Russia to stop it?
Things got really interesting because this is one of those wars where right now in the current state of the world, we are seeing so many stakeholders and big powers at play. Now imagine I think it's very rare that both India and Pakistan are in Russian camp along with China. It's unprecedented. So imagine that, and then you have Iran. So the sanctions, when we talk about it, I was talking to my business friends in India, that they have been, exchanging and exchanging in terms of their currencies, swapping currencies and everything with Russia. And it increased manifold. So in terms of the sanctions, I'm really very skeptical in terms of how and whether it can work. So the only way it can have impact if we have, in my opinion, some of those big stakeholders to be a part of the conversations and hold Russia more accountable. And within Russia as well, there should be some conversations going on. But other than that, I think the sanctions by itself, the way we are doing it, it's not going to work at all. It's going to create more problem. Because India has its own problem to begin with, the COVID-related stuff. The economy had been stagnated. Imagine Sri Lanka, that defaulted, and it's the country low in terms of they are dependent so much. It was already in trouble with COVID and before that, and then the Chinese data. There's so many things in place, and now this Ukraine. But they're just not the only one. They're the one of the first ones. So many other countries are going to fall now. And that will trigger so many other crises in terms of more refugees. Things that we're seeing right now in Ukraine is just tip of the iceberg. First of all, we are going to see a lot of internally displaced population and their struggles. The struggles beyond just having food and shelter, we are going to see a lot of women trafficking, children trafficking, and so many level of exploitations. But then imagine the food crisis in those regions, the vulnerable regions, and these people are now also going to knock on the doors of the European Union countries. So we're going to see a lot of struggles in the coming months.
So we are seeing that, and we are watching it. We are shocked. We express that shock. Irony is that at the beginning of the war in the Security Council of the UN, a discussion was held. It was presided by the Russians. So we have quite an interesting constellation. But from your perspective, what would it take for the world population and governments to intervene more directly? And should they? Because the only way, if sanctions don't work, then one of the few ways to stop that would be military intervention. Do you see that as even a possibility? Should it be done? Could it be done? I mean, we probably have the curse of the nuclear weapon coming back to haunt us, because that seems to be one of the thresholds for many countries to say, if we get too hard behind Ukraine against Russia, we might actually see a nuclear weapon, even if it's a tactical one, being deployed, which then could lead to a chain reaction. We didn't think about that for probably half a century.
So as is being live streamed, I should not be the one rooting for nuclear war here. But at the same time, I think it's an unprecedented situation that we haven't seen before. I'll talk about it, but I'll go back to your initial comments of it's one of those wars. We are living through it as it's happening, right? One of the most documented ones. Of course, because of the omnipresence of our media, citizen journalism, and so many other things, and open source collection of data and whatnot. So I think in that way, that kind of documentation gives us a perspective that goes beyond misinformation and fake news. I've been following the Chinese channels and the Russian channels and the Middle Eastern ones and whatnot. So I think we definitely should be talking about something out of the box. Other than that, if we are just trying to contain, it's not going to be contained. That's for sure. Russia is not going to be appeased as it is with the current regime with that Ukraine, because they're pretty okay with the long-term conflict there. It's not going to have a problem for that, but it's going to affect the whole other region. For our own interest as humanity, we need to end this conflict as soon as possible.
So just to be clear, what my statement about nuclear weapons, what I meant is we are actually seeing the curse of it, that it is around, because it does constrain a lot of options that we have. And so I truly hope that it never will come to dropping another one of those. This issue of what is the responsibility of in that and react to that, where do we see a limit where we are actually almost have an obligation to act in whichever way we can think of acting? And maybe a second part to that question, what is your view of when, if at all, people within Russia might put some pressure onto the regime, because there seems to be quite a bit of propaganda going on that is, to the extent that we can judge, effective?
I have very few insights on what the people of Russia can safely do or not do right now, unfortunately. But I think, coming to the first part of your question, this conflict makes us see the huge chasms in what we have built in terms of the world economic system, in terms of the world political systems, including the UN and other structures. These were built in a post-war context. The Security Council contains who it contains because of the politics of the time, and cannot solve contemporary problems. It just can't, because of the structure of it, as you mentioned. But there's also another thing that's been going on since that war. We've been using our international institutions and systems to build more and more and more and more humanitarian responses. A lot of this is great. We have better standards now. We have a lot of humanitarian law, international law on humanitarian issues, on human rights, we have a lot of standards, norms, procedures, organizations, systems to provide humanitarian response. And we've been building those instead of fixing the political problems or issues. And now this is just the culmination of that. We've seen it over the past years in Syria and other places too. But this is just all of a sudden, it's in our faces. How can the global humanitarian system, set of institutions, the logistics systems, the commodity movement, et cetera, respond in this case? And it can, because it won't have the commodities, it won't have the transport systems, it won't be able to mobilize the logistics because of the things that were mentioned earlier, and because there's not the political will to mobilize the funding that it will take to do it. So what I fear is, even if the global community mobilizes to support the people of Ukraine in Europe, what will not happen is having enough support for the people in Yemen or the people in Peru or the people in Lebanon or other places. So we've got then an exacerbation of already egregious global inequality. And this conflict is just epitomizes what is happening there.
So the disconnection that Pam is talking about, like imagine the Sustainable Development Goals, all the 17 of them. We have to now go back to the drawing board and have an understanding of what is going on and how to achieve it in this changed world and the changed context, and whether or not we need to have more goals that talks about displacement and so many other things in between. It hasn't been there. So it's something that kind of forcing us to rethink something. And Ukraine is just a part of the puzzle.
So in a way, we got two shocks, right? We got the COVID shock,
right,
and then we got the Ukraine shock. And we were absolutely not ready for either one of them, although we should have been, if we would have been more foresightful rather than reactionary. But does that actually tell us that, in a way, we have reached a point where we are, to a certain extent, have to be bystanders because we don't have the means, or the will in some instances, or the means to really intervene and shut down that suffering and crisis.
Now is the time to rethink. I mean, it's during a crisis like this, maybe we can get people to rethink energy use, rethink agricultural systems.
But a lot of the rethinking is going the wrong way. So why I'm so insistent about saying there was all of this inflation going on before the war is because we're seeing, you know, I'm a creature of Washington, D.C., they always say, never let a good crisis, you know, go without making it into an opportunity. And I see some ugliness in terms of this opportunity. So, and I also see, to your point, we could do some great things. So fertilizer prices are going, you know, just beyond belief, right? Because potash, you know, most of the elements of fertilizer are coming from this part of the world. But then we see the Brazilian government, some of the state governments where it's big agricultural regions, talking about opening up indigenous lands for potash mining. Like what? I see the EU backing away from their very important farm to fork strategy, which is part of the new Green Deal over there. President Macron being one of the leading voices there saying, well, that was all decided pre the war. And now we have to revisit that. And that to me was really an important move globally where we're talking about cutting back pesticide use, fertilizer use, actually increasing organic farming across the EU. And now the EU is joining the US preposterous coalition on productivity growth, which our own secretary, my old boss, has said he launched as a complete counter to the EU farm to fork. So we have now seen some clouds at a time when, instead of seeing a fertilizer crisis as an opportunity to think about cover crops and other kinds of conservation practices that can help improve the globe. Instead of seeing the crisis in sunflower oil as a new spark in the conversation about food versus fuel, things that I'm really thinking of. I agree that we may need to add on to the Sustainable Development Goals as if 17 weren't enough, but I don't think that the ones that we have are the wrong ones. It's the, and I think that we need to say, just Nancy Reagan, just say no. I mean, some of this stuff that's going on in the name of the war, it to me is just retrenchment. It's the old guard coming back and seizing the opportunity at a time. Here we are in the Global Futures Laboratory where we should call this out for what it is.
Great point. So let's elaborate a little bit on the opportunity to rethink. That, or one issue that is quite obvious if you do that, is that takes time, and you know, time is running out on Ukraine. So is the world willing to sacrifice Ukraine for other purposes?
Well, I don't think that's the choice that we're confronted with. I don't think anyone wants to sacrifice Ukraine. I don't think that, okay, so here's the whole thing I have with the Coalition for Productivity Growth that the UN, that the US pushed at the Global Food Summit last year. We already know there's enough food in the world to feed people. It's problems of distribution, inequities, corruption. And if we keep pushing this message about productivity growth and that we're going to have to increase world food production by 70% to feed the globe in 2030 or 2050, I look at, we have an empowered women farmers across the globe. They don't have access to land tenure in a lot of the countries, and women are the world's farmers. We have a huge problem about food waste, which, people say behind, China and the US, it's the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases, besides the fact that all that food's wasted. So there are a lot of things to work on that we can work on in terms of our sustainable development goals that move us in the right direction. I don't think anyone wants to sacrifice Ukraine. There are some immediate things we could do. I'm not the global person. We know that there are stores of commodities in Ukraine. They can't get out. They can't help people because the rail system's a mess. The Black Sea's closed off. People are saying, well, maybe we'll try to use Romanian ports, but that's a lot more expensive. I mean, again, that's not my expertise, but we've got to figure out ways to help these countries that are dependent upon grain from Russia and Ukraine. And we're going to have to put more money into the World Food Program. And by the way, I just want to call out our own ambassador, Cindy McCain from Arizona, who opposed publicly the appointment of a Russian as the vice president of the executive board of the World Food Program. I like that. She won, and they put a poll in that job. So I think everywhere we look, we have to start doing those sort of things.
I would agree, Kathleen, that nobody wants to sacrifice Ukraine, but do we actually have an option to avoid it? Or is right now, did we set up a scenario by a convolution of actions that we already discussed, being too reactionary for quite a while, not drawing the right conclusions from Syria, from Chechnya, Bosnia, Aleppo? We saw the way these things happen. Crimea, which is really close to what is happening right now. Are we, in essence, without any means now to stop that and have to watch that play out?
Another interesting aspect of this is a realignment politically across the globe too. I don't know if everybody's been watching the votes in the UN, the votes in the Human Rights Council and everything. Fahim already talked about India and Pakistan and China and these issues, but across Africa, there are tremendous interest in supporting Russia in this. Across the Middle East, big realignment. The Saudis won't take our president's call right now. These people we supported and propped up for decades. Chickens are coming home to roost in terms of US foreign policy in Iraq and in other places, with so many countries saying, or so many those in other parts of the world saying, yeah, you're worried now about this. This is what you did in other countries with total impunity. You were there in the Security Council and you vetoed this or that. So I think we're in an even bigger crisis politically, globally, about, do we have any consensus on values? Do we have any consensus on global governance anymore? Do we have any idea on what coalitions will be still standing 10 years from now or not? It's a really frightening time in many ways because people just don't know what is going to happen. And unfortunately, then there's another collateral effect. When times are frightening and people are fearful, what do? They support autocrats. They look for simple answers. They want somebody to tell them what to do. And that is feeding into this whole, we already have an increase in autocracy all around, and now we've got a much less stable global situation, which is just feeding that. So it does seem sometimes like there's some kind of vicious cycle about this, but one can't, Peter, I don't think one can say, this is it. We just have to say this is it. The only thing people can do is be hopeful and try to do whatever they can do in their town, in their village, in their country, in their legislature, in their state legislature, in their national legislature, fighting for these things within their faith communities. Actually, I have some faith in some faith communities right now, too, for bringing a lot of these things to light about equity and fairness and justice there. So
as a group that we are looking into within academia for the future, within our lab, within our college, within our schools, I think it's very important to imagine, ideate, and design some of the micro level solutions with the people who live through these experiences, rather than having a top-down design part. One of the major issues with such disconnection is this top-down designs and applications. People who are being affected should be a part of the conversation, not as a token, but from the get-go to the application side of it. And we have to reimagine so many other things, but imagine, fast forward, how it affects us, like ASU, our college, our labs. We need to be ready to reimagine our higher education, where we should be ready to have students who would be under blackouts. I have students who are in Yemen, could not submit things deadline because they had blackouts, they had bombing. But he is one of the top performers in my program. So, instead of being reactive and having emergency funds, I'm just highlighting all the things that we do right now, which is so dated. Some crisis happens, we have emergency fund, we are flying in some scholars. These are important, believe me, and I really like those things. But we need to go beyond that. We need to imagine a place where these scholars can come, take refuge, not just physically, but also online through cyberspace, and also create solutions that can create new scholarships for these ideas. And then also for the degree programs, for the requirements, so many other things. So these are the things, these are, I think, for us, not entirely low-hanging fruit, but definitely we would be able to do those things.
And I'm fully in support of that. And Pam, I also agree that we cannot give up, but I'm looking at some of the timelines and I'm looking at the situation, and we really seem to have reached a point where we have very little we can do to steer the course that is playing out, which seems to go towards a fairly horrible scenario. And that is, I think, one of the tragedies of not having been prepared and then falling into a situation that's very difficult to.
This is true, but this strikes me as a very privileged viewpoint in one sense. Most people in the world don't feel they have control over any of this, or that they could have done anything to change any of this. We somehow do think we could have done something differently, which is interesting in itself. We are living in a nation, we are educated, we are, of an elite who could have been doing something. Whereas, a lot of people in the world don't even have that sense that they might have been able to do something to change the trajectory of world history here. It's interesting to me. I don't know, I think sometimes we resort, I don't know, in my career in humanitarian work in the UN, sometimes we just had to focus on what we could do. I worked a lot on issues of sexual violence and conflict. We had to work on reaching women who were affected, providing medical care, providing psychosocial support, pushing for court cases to prosecute people, pushing for documentation and impunity and these kinds of things. And there are a lot of people out there doing that kind of thing, just trying to get down and nitty gritty and do things. I have to mention one statistics here just because of my own background in women's health. There are 256,000 pregnant Ukrainian women. In the next 3 months, 80,000 deliveries will happen. Just think where those deliveries are going to happen. On a train, in a bunker, in the subway, running to Poland, in some neighbor's house there, etc. And then thinking about what that means for the family, what that means also, maybe another circle in all this, is that what we do know is that trauma affects everything. And it affects everything multi-generationally. So every family, every child born into this situation, born of trauma, every child malnourished because of these problems, development is going to be affected. And we know now the neurobiology enough to know that this trauma is multi-generational. So even if a miracle happened tomorrow and the Russians pulled out and somehow we were able to mobilize all the resources to rebuild Ukraine as it was, tremendous damage has already been done. And
to your point, some of what we are seeing now is actually rooted in trauma in the past.
Exactly.
So this is not coming out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
It actually has been rooted. Yeah, running out of time. What I would like to do is to just have one final thought from each of you about where you think this could end. And it is, or you can actually make a statement of your likings. What are your thoughts?
How would you like it
to the present situation? I mean, what keeps you focused on it? What are your thoughts about it? And you're not let sleep about it. So let's start with Kathleen and go deep.
Wow. I don't know. I know the first thing I do every morning when I wake up is check the news and what's going on in Ukraine. And it's fascinating. I will just, I guess, jump on the comments I already made about how the world is shaking up in terms of alliances. And you talk and big picture and values. I just look at the little world of agriculture and I just think of farmland. And I don't know, the Chinese are buying farmland in the United States of America. They're investing in agriculture heavily in countries in Africa. And I just think that there's opportunity for us to be more strategic in a lot of these issues. Does that stop the war in Ukraine? No. Does it help the Ukrainian people at this moment of crisis? No. But I do think it's a wake-up call right now that we need to really pay attention to.
I'd like to be really hopeful here because I've been working with refugees and displaced population for some time. And I think reimagining, reconstructing, reinfrastructuring hope is very critical. And how we do that, I'm not a food expert, I'm not a humanitarian expert, but I'm an educator. I would like to see the young Ukrainians and Russians coming together alongside other global citizens to imagine, like we can start it here, to imagine a global future, smaller, but then, pushing it further, doing more than just, some lab projects. And that can be on agriculture, that can be on healthcare. We imagine that, like the Pam was talking about SDG, like maternal health, that's one of the SDGs. And it's a disaster in Yemen. It's a disaster in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now it's a disaster in Europe. We haven't imagined that. So I would hope to see all these people who are in conflict, not just in Ukraine and Russia, working together to solve this. And we should be there to help. And that's
Oh no, that's a tough one.
Come on.
I hope, I don't know, one thing is that I think people are learning things. I think the shock of seeing what they're seeing on TV, or maybe of knowing somebody who's affected, whether they're in Europe or in North America or whatever, I hope is opening some eyes to global history, to what happened in Ukraine in the 1930s, one of the worst famines in history. speaking of resentments and another thing, I hope that the European Union and the countries there, as they see people who look like them crossing their border and they're opening their homes, will start to think, wait a minute, just a very few months ago, when Belarus tried to push people across the border to Poland, and they were Afghans and Iraqis, and it became a huge crisis about a few dozen people, that maybe they'll start thinking, wait a minute, maybe we were not thinking about that right. It raises maybe some reflection, self-reflection on foreign policies and on refugee policies and on who are the other and who aren't the other, and some kind of global humanity.
And as you mentioned before, our place in the world, and who has the means, who is quote unquote privileged, and can do something, who can. We have reached the end of our hour. I would like to thank all of you, Kathleen, Fahim, Pam, for a very stimulating discussion. And we will continue these discussions about Ukraine as we follow it along and look at the different aspects that will evolve, many of which we just cannot foresee at that point. So, and thanks for attending. Thanks for all who were on the live stream. And with that, we